You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, Weekly Art History for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm excited. I'm doing another artist interview. I have Tyler Loftis here, a contemporary painter based out of New York. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So, when I'm doing these artist interviews, I feel like it's always important, learning about someone. I always love a good origin story. So can you take us back? Like, where did you first become interested in art? What was your first love in art? Either as an artwork that inspired you, a medium that you fell in love with? What was your starting point?
Well, I was born this way, and, reverse engineering, that sounds like a pretty romantic and fun idea, but when you're little in a culture that doesn't really understand art yet, or the act of being a painter professionally, or even just at an amateur level, it's very disconcerting. So it took me a long time to sort of understand that I was an artist, but I've always been an artist. Always kind of seen the world through an artist's eyes, and again, there was a lot of pain in Michigan where I grew up because there just wasn't a lot of people or places to turn to find guidance or even just to understand who I was, until eventually making my way to New York and then sort of understanding that, wow, you can actually be an artist, and that there's a lot of people out in the world that do this.
And so there are a couple threads there that I find really interesting. One thing you say, you grew up in a part of Michigan where art didn't seem like a viable option, is what I'm hearing. You didn't see a lot of role models who were artists around you where you were growing up. Where was that specifically?
West Michigan. So I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but grew up in Grand Rapids and then Grand Haven, Michigan. And yeah, I think it really speaks to a lot of American culture, to be honest. I just, after traveling to Europe and sort of seeing how, different communities and cultures interact with art and sort of embrace it in their food, their clothing, almost in their lifestyle, it sort of helped me understand that, the United States really needs us as artists to sort of speak more on this topic and sort of share more and help children and adults really kind of get over the idea that art is something that you need to study or you need to learn something about before you interact with it. My big passion is art is for everybody. And growing up in a place that didn't have much art or access to art, I was ostensibly self-taught until I did come to New York. But on getting to New York, the teachers actually asked me where I'd been studying. So it's kind of funny. I think that no matter who you are, art just comes from that other place. And it's such a natural, intuitive, deep thing. But I think, all it takes is standing in front of a piece to really ignite your own imagination and creativity. So that's really a big message for me. I go back to Michigan quite a bit to help out spread that message. And I spread it here in my studio in Tribeca as well.
So then, can I ask you, because I'm picturing, like, when you say there wasn't a lot of art around, are you talking art in the museum context and gallery context, or, are you taking that broader view of art, like, the public art, the street art, whether it's the lovely mural on the side of a building or, other things like that? Did you have the traditional art program in school, art classes that you would go to once a week and stuff like that? Were those kinds of things lacking, or was it just not the and I want to use giant air quotes in an audio medium here, but was it just the fine art was lacking?
It was the relationship to fine art.
Okay.
Fine art was something for, it was an exclusive thing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a day-to-day thing. Now, there's a beautiful sculpture, a beautiful Calder in downtown Grand Rapids. These things, they do get into you. And as I was saying, they actually, at a deeper level, they sort of taught me and sort of influenced me. But I didn't have that cognizance that it was okay to sort of see the world through, the eyes that I did, and artist's eyes, which, turns out the older you get, you realize there's a lot more people with these same experiences and obviously historically speaking as well. And we're a valuable, important part of society. And I think that kind of, I'm at a point in my life where I can kind of understand and see that a lot better, where I hope to help, kids and adults that are sort of, cloistered in their small town with not a lot of community, sort of understand their real importance and how much we need them in society.
Yeah. And, this is the second time you've mentioned seeing the world through an artist's eyes. And I want to tease out what specifically that means to you, because I remember way back when I was in school, one of the things that has stuck with me now for decades, I remember one of my professors said, when we're looking at an artwork, artists seem to look at it differently. And his lens on it was, he always said, real artists, and I feel like I should have air quotes again, he said, they look at works and immediately the wheels start turning. How would I make that? What is the process with which that was created? Where was this line taped? Was this freehand? Is this oil? Like, all of that process stuff that we get into. Were you, because I very often find myself looking at stuff and I have to consciously decide, am I looking at this through the lens of how I would create it and what steps I would go to, or am I looking at this to appreciate and just enjoy the piece and be moved by it? What does it mean to you to look at it through an artist's eyes? Are you looking at the sunset and thinking, how would I capture this? Are you looking at the scene, thinking about the framing of the composition as you're walking down the street? What does that mean to you?
Well, it's a great question. From a young age, I really understood the language of art, how the dashes and the tones and the colors sort of create a picture. I was sort of born with that, where, which Van Gogh was working in this certain way, or, which Rembrandt. And I didn't even know that was a thing until I got to New York, that I sort of had that gift. But I think, speaking even more directly to your point, I think the language, the way a painting is created is its true story. I think that's when you walk inside the house and experience, what's happening. The image a lot of times can be like the front door, I think, that you walked through. So as artists, we are kind of more consciously curious of the way something's made, because, as we know, French painting has a different vibe, is created differently than an Italian painting, than a Spanish painting. And that holds true for the entire world. So I think when people get sensitized to that, almost like an artist would, I think that's when the real, magic starts to happen. You really kind of get in touch with what it was like to be alive at that time, or what it would be like to be alive in that place, even in today, somebody's making art today. So yes, I do think of it that way, but I think that that's also a really important part of it, that maybe a lot of people, and I say this a lot, as artists, we can see, different things happening in our own work or others, but truly, just because that we can verbalize it, or maybe we can't verbalize it, even if we can create a piece, it doesn't mean that our experience is going to be any richer than somebody off the street. It may not have the same terms or the same way, or even the same thoughts to express, but their experience may be just as deep, if not deeper. And I find that happens a lot because of the parts that make up the whole of any piece of art.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting. You say you were born, and I'm jealous of this, because I am not a person who is an intuitive person. I don't have that artist's eyes, despite what I am doing for a living and what I do every week on here. Like, I do this show and I studied art because I loved art and I was fascinated by it, but it didn't click with me intuitively. I had to break it apart and figure out the systems that underpin everything. That's how I make sense of it. And so I'm curious, you're born with this ability to sort of see and make sense of things. And, that is a true talent, and that is something to be appreciated. And it's sort of sad that you were in a space where you didn't feel like that was recognized growing up, but that wasn't the end of your story. So can you talk about, you moved from Michigan to New York, and you studied in New York, I think, multiple schools. Am I right there?
Mm-hmm.
Can you
Yeah.
tell us about your journey through there and developing your own studio practice?
Yeah, well, actually, just to reverse engineer just a little bit, I actually dropped out of high school in Michigan. I was walking to school one day, ended up in the middle of the woods, and in the woods, and basically just had this epiphany that I was done. And of course, it shocked everybody, and it was a big to do. But I've never looked back, and so I came to New York, and I went to a school that was portfolio driven. So I was able to get in. It was a wonderful school. It is a wonderful school. It's called the New York Studio School. It's in Greenwich Village. And then I took some classes at the Academy, New York Academy, which is actually coincidentally right across the street from my current studio. But like I said, the intuitive path that sort of brought me to the professional level that I'm at was completely organic, and it happened through growing up in Michigan. So as hard as it was for me, I have a lot of love and I have a lot of appreciation for our culture there, for the Midwest. And I think helping sort of shine a light on that through the fine arts is also really important to me. But my studio practice has just been, even from a very, very young age, I was always very intense about it. Nothing was ever finished. I always knew that I needed to work more, but I felt like at birth, really I was downloaded with all of this stuff and this intensity. And even when I was little in grade school, I would tell myself, and this is so crazy looking back on it, but I would tell myself for 2 years, I'm only going to do line work. Then for the next 2 years, I'm just going to do shadow. And I always knew I'm not ready to do figures yet. It was just, and it was really coming out of the ether. It wasn't coming out of any teachers or any practice around me. So when I look at art and think about making art, I really think of it as coming from a real dreamlike, childlike space that I think that we can all access very fluidly as long as we feel safe and as long as we feel that our opinion matters, which is to me the most important thing with art. It's so personal. It's between you and the piece. So, I like to highlight my story as sort of proof of that the relationship you have with making art or seeing art, it's just creativity. And that doesn't come from, reading a book or necessarily somebody telling you. It can, of course, but also, the heart of it comes from a magical place. And as an artist, I think you spoke earlier about what an artist's eyes are. I think to see the world in just as a continually magical place.
And so then what was that experience like, having been largely self-taught, and then you went to the academy, and from what I gather, you had a more, say, traditional education there in, emphasis on observational drawing and painting and striving for accuracy and all that. Like, as you're learning the techniques, was that an easy shift? Was that like finally this thing I've always wanted? Or was it like, hey, I've been doing this my own way and I kind of know what I'm doing. Why are you pushing this on? Like, what was that experience like in that transition?
That's a really good question. It was the latter. I already sort of knew who I was and knew what I was doing. But painting and drawing from the model every day, of course, really... it's just such an age-old natural process that you just keep syncing up with your internal and external process. So it was great because I got to practice. But honestly, what I learned and got most from school, and I think this is really important for all the artists out there, is I got community. I got friends. And when I got connected to art history, not through the stuffy, this date and that date, but through teachers who really loved, say, Giotto, who really loved, de Kooning, who really loved cave painting. And it really sort of, those ended up being kind of more of your friends. You really saw that there was a lot of different ways to make art, and it really kind of, it was freeing. And it's just exciting. And since I've spent a lot of time in Europe, kind of going and tracking down these pieces and places, and it's just magical to realize there's all these people that have been doing this incredible stuff in the same exact way since the beginning of time. I laugh because obviously the tools have never changed. It's just a piece of wood with some hair on the end and, basically goop on a wall. And
yeah, I mean, I like to think there's a little more to it, but you're right that it is one of those things that we've been working with these tools and the paints and stuff, basically as long as humans have been around. I always like to say that, art is sort of how and why we got out of the trees. But I want to take a quick break, and then I want to get down into some more specifics of your art, because when I have the privilege of talking to an artist, I always love to get their insights into the work, the intention, and the process. So after a quick break, we'll be talking about your painting, The Shell. Welcome back. Today I am talking to Tyler Loftis, a contemporary painter based out of New York, originally from Michigan. And, in our first segment, you were talking about your training and how you came to art. But I think the best way to understand it is to just look at the art itself. And so when I asked your publicist, like, which painting we could talk about in this, she sent me a picture of The Shell. And can you tell me and tell all of us about this work? What's the idea behind it? How did you select looks like a conch shell here as a subject?
Well, I mean, I think as an artist, there's so many magical things around you that it's the way something is created, as I said before, that really gets exciting. So a lot of things can be the avenue or the vehicle to do that. So in this case, it was a shell, and, the outside sort of the shell and the inside of the shell having that sort of pearly, glossy kind of amazing texture, and then the outside being rougher. I just saw it as kind of this magical thing, and in a way to express my sort of modern take, I guess, on oil painting. And, painting with color is a huge passion. The sun is one of my biggest muses. And so just really kind of pushing the color and the line and the contrast between the two almost as far as I could.
I do love a good color piece. Like, as I'm looking at this, there's something that I find really enjoyable about the ways in, let's say, the blues and the negative space. I can see this mix of, like, obviously the blues and the whites, but I see hints of like a yellow green and almost like a salmon color mixed into there as well. And like, I personally love seeing nice color harmonies. And I love when I see some colors that are almost a little bit unexpected, a warm tinge to some blues, because on some level it shouldn't work. And as somebody who has painted, like, I appreciate that you're playing a dangerous game there, because you overblend them and the colors turn muddy. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, when you put opposite colors next to each other, the contrast makes each look brighter in comparison. But when opposite colors mix, they turn muddy. They turn to a dull neutral, a brown or gray or something like that. And as I'm looking at this, I see a lot of stuff that just, like, you have to have just the right touch to get them in there. And I appreciate that. And so for you, this is largely about the color and the aesthetic situation here, or is there like a sentimental value to this shell, or was it just about like the play of the colors and the textures and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was the play in the textures, which, sort of creates a sentimental connection. But really, I mean, painting is, to me, it's a meditation on life. It's about stopping in time for a sec. I mean, it's ostensibly the, stop and smell the roses. And so the inspiration really gets to be just being in the moment and finding all of these beautiful things in nature, and just how nature is constructed of all these opposing things. And like you said before, colors that sort of go together that you wouldn't actually expect, because in our day-to-day lives, especially now, everything is so fast and quick and on a screen. When you can really give somebody that moment to just look at a shell, I find that kind of kind of magical. And again, like a child, like children, especially young children, take time and pick things up and look at them, and they're curious about, the touch of it. And I think that is what an artist kind of carries with them. And hopefully we can help, people carry that with them, that experience with them into adulthood as well, to just take that time to sort of look at life, not in sort of the rushed, what I have to get to or what I've done or this or that, but just be in the moment for a sec. So if I can kind of grab enough things from the experience to sort of captivate somebody for a second, to spend a little bit more time just looking at a shell, to me, that's the huge success, and hopefully creates a little meditation, a little moment. And maybe, like you said in the beginning, a little joy, because that's really, honestly, when somebody says, I just feel a bit of joy, that's a huge compliment for me.
No, I do enjoy it. And I love the way you're talking about it, because the older I get, the more I appreciate that whole sentiment of looking at things the way that a child does, with that sort of just pure joy, that without,
Yes.
I am, a millennial. I grew up in the 2000s, was back when I was cool-ish or cool adjacent, and everything was with like this ironic sort of detachment and everything like that. And the older I get, the more I really love things that are just earnest, that have the courage to be direct and to say, I just think this is beautiful. And there's just, it's wonderful to have something that is so straightforward. And I think that's in a lot of ways uncomfortable. Like as an artist, when I was younger, there was a lot of comfort in layering stuff in esoteric references that made me able to pretend that I'm smart, and anyone who doesn't get that reference just isn't on my level, and it feels a little bit more raw when you just lay it all out there for everyone to see. It's much more vulnerable. At least that's how I see it from my artist's lens, if you will. And I don't spend a lot of time making visual arts, but my whole career is about the enjoyment and appreciation and creation of art. And so that's kind of the lens that I'm at right now. I love when I see this here, and I do have a question, because you're saying you just see these things and you want to put it out there. It's hard to imagine you encountered a shell on the streets of New York, so where did this specific object, like, is this a shell that was picked up on a beach on a vacation? Is this something that you have, like, you have a collection of objects in your studio? How specifically did this subject come your way?
First of all, I just wanted to say it was really well put. When things are not sort of shrouded in, that kind of safe irony, I just really appreciated that comment, because it is raw.
That's what I go for, and I couch it in humor because it makes it safer for me to admit all this.
That was really, really well put. Well, so again, I mean, some of these cliches are true. I mean, artists are very childlike, and like a child, I sort of collect things and have things around me that I don't even necessarily know where they've come from, but I just, over the years, have had them. This shell, I don't know, but I do have sort of a collection of objects. And I remember going to Matisse's museum in Nice, and it was so cool seeing all the objects that for years had been in his paintings, all the shells and the little bowls and things that I'd recognized. And it's just one of those artist things to have these certain, things around you or little collectibles. And it is kind of childlike. And so ultimately I don't remember, but yeah, there is some sort of interesting connection about having these little trinkets and things around you that sort of amass more meaning over the years. And then they just kind of creep into your paintings here and there, and, become little players, little stand-ins. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think that no matter how elaborate the image is, whether it's a Sistine Chapel or anything, I go back to the way something is painted. I mean, that's the real vulnerability, and that's the real message. So if you're presenting just a shell, whatever meaning that has to you, you're right. You are 100% right. And all the feelings and thoughts you're having, you are right. But because it's a shell, people can dig in, I think, quicker to the color, the joy of the line work against the maybe some of the rougher way the paint is put down. And I just like a child, doesn't really care about the story only. They're also just into the colors and the shapes and the feelings. And I really think like some of the greatest art out there really presents those two stories.
So I think there's something beautiful about the idea of collecting all these objects that are meaningful to you. And I think you're right. It does go back to that whole, cliche of the artist is the adult with the mind of a child. And I think, and I mean that in the best possible way. I always tell people that, the greatest thing that happened in my life and career was working with children and having children, because it totally changed my outlook on what I think is meaningful. And I, already said, I think there is something wonderful about the purity of that expression. And so I think there's something nice about the idea of you walking into your studio and you've got all these objects that you've collected that caught your attention, seemed meaningful in whatever way. And can you just walk us through a little bit of your process of creation? So like you walk into your studio, you see the shell, it looks nice. You talked about the play of the rough exterior and the polished interior. Are you working on just that one painting for the day? Do you block in the colors and then go to something else and then come back to it? Is it a process of revision and are you working wet on wet? Like I love to get into the weeds on this, so like what are you doing here?
Well, again, because I was sort of born this way and I've been kind of at it so long, I feel like I have a lot of tools in the toolbox. So some of my paintings may look a little bit different, but I don't have a stratagem that I go into each picture with. I sort of meditate first, or I have this sort of very quiet, intuitive impulse to paint something, whether it's a friend, an object in the studio, even if it's a nude. I have this intuition, but once I start, I'm in deep conversation with the moment and the painting, and they really, I'm in a little bit of an altered state. Not so much that I can't still, speak English and all of that, but I am in an altered state where I don't really see colors. I don't really see shapes. I just see that one thing is reacting with another thing. And so this other thing has to happen. And it just becomes this conversation, this process. And then at some point, the process sort of turns a corner and there becomes almost nothing left to do. And when there's this little bit of remainder left, this little bit of curiosity, that's when the painting is finished. But every single painting is a new process. It's extremely daunting. And it's one thing that I've had to get used to, being, continually uncomfortable every time you start a picture and even inside the picture. But you just have that faith and you just, you keep hoping for the best. And I think that it's something that's not talked about a lot, but it takes a lot of courage, to be an artist. It takes a lot of courage, sometimes mid-process through a work, to keep going and really, have faith that it is going to come to completion. Because as a fine artist, you're really walking into a snowstorm almost every time. And it's exciting, but it's also extremely daunting. And it can be, that's kind of, in my opinion, probably the hardest part of being a painter. That's the hardest work, is continually having that faith during the process.
Interesting. So it sounds to me like you're looking at stuff as essentially the collection of the elements. You're focused on the arrangements of the lines, the shapes, the colors, and how one element plays off of another to figure out what the next step is going to be. And that's an interesting way to construct it. And I see where that would be daunting. I can see where that would be difficult. Like, no, and I mean that in all seriousness, because my own process has always been it's been a little bit different in different stages of my life, but you know, working from direct observation and having to make the decisions in the moment was always very difficult for me. I'm the kind of person who would walk around something in my head for a while and figure out exactly what I wanted to do and then do it, you know? And in the studios where I was working from observation of a model, or I was working observation of a still life or anything like that, and I'm having to look at all these elements and just turn my brain off to some extent in that way, you know what I'm saying? And just focus on draw what you see, not what you know. Don't plot this out. Don't fall back on a schema. Don't do all these things that are in your comfort zone. It's difficult. And so I admire someone who has the courage to do that, because I do recognize that that is, you know, it can produce beautiful results, but it's an uncomfortable place to be in sometimes. Like you said, it's exciting, but it you know, you're facing something down every single time. And so it sounds to me like you kind of work on one thing exclusively at a time instead of going back and forth between canvases. Or are you fighting an army of canvases, staring them all down at once?
And you know, it's funny, I become less adversarial the older I get, because I sort of am more acclimatized to the discomfort. It was super painful in school and even after, because it was like looking up at Mount Everest every time. But I work on multiple pictures. But yeah, I'm looking at a piece right now that I've been working on for 15 years. And I hope to finish that soon. And some pictures, they wrap up in a day or two, and some take months or years. And it's just, you really have to just give over to the process and be completely vulnerable. But the results that makes, I find, are less human, you know, less my own, and more sort of creative. And, you know, for lack of a better word, cosmic, which enables everybody else to kind of have their own opinion and not think about the technique and not have to think about the structure, but just to sort of dive in and have their own emotions and their own feelings. And, you know, I really enjoy that. I mean, I think of myself as a civil servant, you know, sort of helping people exercise that creative muscle. And if I can do that quicker than not and have them sort of shut off, you know, what's the story? Can you tell it to me? Can I read something about this? You read enough in today's world. You have enough explained to you in today's world. You know, this is an opportunity where no batteries required, you know, no explanation required. Just go up. Your viewpoint is way more important than mine, way more important when you're looking at a piece of art, especially my own. But when you're looking at all art, even if you're, you know, looking at the Mona Lisa and it's the first piece of art you've ever seen, your view is so much more important than mine. And so I just I like to celebrate that. And I like to not hide the elements that create the picture, and just have people really see behind the screen. So I'm not trying to fool them. I'm not trying to make something that looks like a photograph or looks like something else. And there's nothing wrong with that type of work. But for me, I just really like to show them, you know, the insides and let them sort of use their creativity to sort of work their way through it. Yeah. So for me, I guess really any way that I can kind of help people get creative and sort of spark that imaginative quality is really important. And I like to speak on that with other artists as well. But the last thing I'll say is everybody's got their own process. And I think that's also really important. They've got their own techniques. They've got their own process. They just have their own way that they see the world. And that's what really excites me. Even with someone who hasn't made much art, the way that they paint or draw is so specific to them and so complicated that I wouldn't be able to reproduce what they're doing. And I love that about art. I love that it's so much inside all of us. I mean, not all of us are going to want to be professionals and go through this crazy rigmarole that I go through every time I make a picture, but ostensibly we're all artists. We all dream. And when we even just do like a little sketch or a doodle, there's so much of us in there. And I wouldn't be able to, as a professional, recreate that. And I love that.
Yeah. And it feels like such the modernist philosophy there, in so many ways, coming out with the, truth to materials. You're not looking at a seashell, you're looking at my painting of a seashell, and all of that. And the unique mark making and the idiosyncrasies of our own style. I just want to second that and sign on to your ideas and pretend they were my own, because I love what you're saying there. And I think people need to hear that, because I cannot tell you how many people, like in my line of work, I teach art, and I've had so many people who are like, oh, I'm so glad, you encouraged my kid. I can't draw. I can't do that. I think, a lot of us who grew up in the 1980s and 90s heard a lot of, harsh criticism about our unique mark making. I was told I can't draw, and then I went to the Art Institute of Chicago. So,
wow.
I was clearly not that bad at it. But, I think there is something nice about this idea about, all of our work is okay. And whatever style you go to, whatever marks you're making, however you like to draw is okay. But if I could push you a little bit, if someone is aspiring to draw or to paint, and, they are hesitant, they're nervous, they're, not sure, can you what are some concrete bits of advice that you would give? The way I said, when you mix warm and cool colors or opposites, you're playing a dangerous game because it can get muddy. What are some tips that you have found that might be helpful to somebody who's maybe a little hesitant to get started? Because I know you have done a lot to encourage people. I think you've even done a lot of philanthropic work. I think you started something, to help people encounter art more and be more creative. What have you found is helpful to people to take those first steps when they might be a little hesitant?
Well, first and foremost, the goal is to ignite creativity. So you mentioned the foundation. It's called AllArtWorks, AllArtWorks Foundation. And they share the same premise that I do personally in my practice here in New York and in Michigan and everywhere I go, is that creativity, art is sort of the window or sort of a vehicle to creativity. And the more art we have, the more creativity that we sort of exercise inside of ourselves. And creativity you can use for all things in life. So somebody starting out their own process, or I'd actually even say somebody that doesn't identify as an artist, draw a little bit, see what your mark making looks like. And I think as an adult, you'll find a lot of self-consciousness, but that also sort of, because you're really sort of being vulnerable and telling your own story in a very personal way. But if you can do that, you can also strengthen some aspects of yourself. Now, if you're starting out as an artist, or even if you're a practicing artist that wants to take things a bit further, I think the most important thing is to really center yourself inside of your own practice. Because if you jump ship and try to learn someone else's technique, then basically what you're doing is you're learning someone else's way to see the world. So that's okay if intuitively you feel like that's what you need in certain moments, in certain steps, because it'll actually probably trigger more of some of your own experiences and help you develop. But I would say the most important thing is to really value your voice. You are right. You are 100,000 million cajillion % right. And you have to go into it with that idea. Now that sounds egocentric, but once you start to practice, if you're, an artist, you will see right away that the process is bigger than you and that you're just telling part of the story. It is not about me, and I. It's more about exercising these things inside of you that are basically something that you don't get to decide. You don't really, we're all being honest, you don't get to decide how you draw or how you paint. It is just who you are. And so if you take that even a step further and you go to a museum, you're looking at firsthand accounts of what it was like to be that person living in that time, all the way back to the cave paintings 35,000 years ago. It's an unbroken story of what it was like to be alive. And I just like to excite people going to the museum, instead of like looking at the dates and the this and that, to jump in to this universal language that has never changed. 35,000 years, it's never changed. It's the same language, but it's used in different cultures to express different things. And just like in all different people, you're going to use different aspects of the language of art to describe different parts of the story for who you are. It's so personal. And so also, when you look at art, you're seeing it from a perspective that no one else on the planet has. And instead of being self-conscious and wondering, oh my gosh, am I seeing this right? I got to cheat off somebody's test. No, you're actually seeing it in a way that maybe no one else ever has. So speak up, talk, let's communicate more. Let's try to feel more comfortable, because art is for everybody. And it is one of the deepest, most human and most continual things that we've ever done. So for me, if you draw a little bit or you look at art, it's all part of the same stuff, just exercising that creative muscle. It hopefully in the end makes you feel more connected with yourself, but also with your culture and maybe even the past. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard just to say one simple thing, but I think overall is just really value your own perspective.
That is so much more beautiful than what I was fishing for there. I was hoping I'd get like, oh, maybe the rule of thirds is great, or start with something non-objective, low pressure, and just enjoy the process. But like, you make such a great philosophical point there, and I think it is worth repeating what you said about how when you try to learn or mimic someone else's technique, you're trying to see the world through their eyes, from their perspective. And that is such a wonderful, broader point about how art is a window into other people's perspectives, as well as a mirror up to society and the world that we're living in. It serves both functions simultaneously. And there is something so nice about the connection that is established and the way we come to understand each other through art, and to appreciate other people's art is to, on some level, appreciate their unique perspective and their unique humanity. And I think that is a message we need to hear and take to heart. I'd like to say now more than ever, but really, as long as humans have existed, I think that's been a necessity, that empathy, that connection, that understanding. And I really appreciate your sharing such wonderful insights. So listeners, if you want to learn more about Tyler Loftis and his work, check the links in the show notes. Of course, I'm going to have the link to the website and all of that stuff so you can see more. But thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been great. Really appreciated your thoughts and ideas as well. Very clear.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.